Hi everyone, welcome back to ISTE Games and Simulation Network, our Encore presentations from the conference. And we are really lucky to have Russell Brandon back with us. Now, he actually did two things at the ISTE conference. First of all, he gave a great session at our playground about teacher as a dungeon master, and then also at our LAN party, he was an actual dungeon master. We had a table playing D&D. Now we have a short 30-second clip. We won't show it now, but it was something about the players not exactly getting his accent, whether it was Scottish or Jamaican. So I don't know if we'll hear any of that today, but we're going to turn it over to him, and he's going to give you the session that he had at the playground. So welcome, Russell.
All right. Hi, everyone. So one of the things that we talked about a lot at ISTE in general was using games in the classroom. And one of the big things for me, at least, seeing pre-created games, so games that you might bring into a classroom. People talk about Minecraft, a lot of digital games a lot of the time, games that are made by other people. And for me, one big shift was actually creating a game design club that a lot of my students were able to, come in after school and start playing games. And there was one point at which students asked, they like, Mr. Russell, when are we actually going to start making games? And I said, that's a great question. Well, how do I get you guys started doing that? And luckily, a lot of them were really interested in making board games. And I thought, well, I mean, Dungeons and Dragons is basically all about making a game. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of the big shifts. I mean, I played D&D previously years and years ago, but it kind of became this thing where the rule sets have changed, and I just threw myself into this space where I said, okay, I'll be your dungeon master, but I'm going to teach you guys how I go through this process as well. And so one of the biggest things, and I remember I talked about this previously at one of these hangouts, what is a narrative. So for me, that's really where it starts, because if I can tell a story with my students, I can more than likely engage them, especially the ones who are really enthusiastic about that sort of story. And so pretty much the first thing I ask myself is, well, what do I use to start that story? And in the case of the ISTE campaign, I can share my screen if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be cool. And the thing about it is, with you mentioning the narrative, that's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing teachers starting up, game design clubs and things like that. But the focus seems to be much more, I would say, on the coding, and then maybe on the graphics and the visual. But the narrative doesn't seem to get mentioned that much.
Yeah, and my background is actually in. I mean, it's in educational technology, but with the focus on teaching reading and writing. And so a lot of the discussions that we would have are about, well, how do you determine whether or not a student's comprehending something or something else? So I mean, basically, this was my first step in making the ISTE campaign, and I just wanted to kind of show what my process looked like, because it ends up being a lot of little bits that you throw around. Like, this is the one folder that I have of all the different like map symbols and everything. But I basically started with, I remember I tweeted out, if ISTE was a city, what would it be called? And we kind of decided to just kind of steal the magazine name there. But the Dungeon Master Guide, which I would recommend, I mean, anyone who wants to like kind of use D&D in their classrooms, to start with that, because it's a really great first step into understanding that, I mean, D&D is not as big as you might think it is. So a lot of the time, people will kind of get overwhelmed as like, oh man, it just takes so much background. They go into, they talk a lot about how you can be as detailed as you want, but it should always be fun. And so that's kind of where I started. And
Well, hey, can we just back it up just a little bit?
oh,
Because
certainly, yeah.
I realize that the group in the Hangout that you're talking to, we're like, oh yeah, D&D, get into it. But we might have some people watching this who have no idea what Dungeons and Dragons is.
Oh, that's
So
great.
do you want to start there?
Yes, I
And then
probably should start
and then
there.
we'll just jump back because I mean I see Trish nodding her head, going yeah, and stuff like that. But for somebody who has, you know, D&D might mean drinks and donuts. What exactly is D&D?
So D&D is kind of is a high fantasy world that's kind of managed by this company called Wizards of the Coast. And essentially, it's this. I mean, it's this big board game company that they started out. It was D&D around the same time that Lord of the Rings um, uh, was first published. I think was one of the first publications of a D&D magazine, and there were some interesting legal kerfuffles between the two because there's a lot of high fantasy overlap. But it's essentially it's a universe that's overlaid with this rule set, and this rule set relies on a lot of dice rolling, on a lot of description of what happens after those dice are rolled. A great way for people who want to get started, and they've been pushing really hard since the newest editions came out, is the Dungeons and Dragons D&D.wizards.com website, and it actually has a bunch of free resources that you can use to get you started on a first campaign. You don't have to buy anything to start. I mean, you don't even have to buy dice if you come down to it, because there are plenty of free apps out there that will actually allow you to roll dice without worrying about it. And so that's D&D in a nutshell. The idea that you're put into this fantasy world, you have a set of rules that usually are based on dice thresholds. So you roll high, that means you succeed. You roll low, that means you fail. And then you get to use all of these different components that Wizards has built over this 20 years of development. You can say, okay, we're in this universe. A lot of people, though, they'll use the rule set and then go completely off book, and they'll make their own world. And that's one of the big things, at least in terms of the guides that are presented out there, is each campaign, each universe that's set up during a game is its own universe, and you can do whatever you want. Yeah, and I would highly recommend this. Basic rules for the tabletop game is a really good place to start. Also, if you're more into board games, just to kind of get you introduced to it, the D&D starter set is also the perfect. I mean, it gives you all the information on how to start a campaign and everything like that. Also, a board game that I've played recently that is actually a really great, like, kind of foray into the mechanics of kind of combat and everything like this is this game called Descent.
Okay.
Which, I mean, there's pretty high overhead in terms of the cost of it, but it's a really fun, if you really like the whole dungeon crawling aspect of it. This would be your game, because this is all about you kind of developing your skills, and especially for a DM, it sets up the entire story for you. You basically read a script, and it usually comes with all these miniatures and all this stuff, and that can be a really fun experience, especially if you want to get into high fantasy, because from what I've seen, at least from what my students have done, is as soon as I started creating campaigns for them, they wanted to start doing it as well. And so if you want to get people interested in it, these two things are really good introductions, because you don't have to work as hard on them. So yeah, that is.
So D&D is a fantasy role play game where there's good and evil, and where you fight the monsters, and you do this all according to an adventure or a campaign that you're going on with everyone else that's playing, right?
Yes. Yeah, and it's basically you tell a story, and everyone is a character in it, and they get to act like they would if they were actually a character. Um, at least on the side, I mean, for me, focusing on that narrative component.
So we've been starting to get questions already. Well, one of them is, how cool would it be to have D&D meet Minecraft? That was our first one.
I mean, adventure maps are actually are probably a good example of that, except your DM is someone who coded the map really early on. But from what, I mean, the stuff that people have made in adventure maps, that is pretty ridiculous in terms of the amount of effort that goes into building a story there. Um, and and the real appeal, because you really could, there are a lot of other role-playing games that,
Hmm.
like Pathfinder, everything like that, that focus on kind of um, the creation of a narrative and then going to live in that narrative and see what happens. Um, that's what I would say. I mean, kind of, I can go ahead and say my nugget of information. If you get anything out of this, find a some sort of structure that you want to use to make your narrative. So whether it be D&D, whether it be, I mean, there's a lot of lore in Minecraft. You could start there as well, or a Pathfinder type game. Starting with that, but then talking about how you can make stories to tell in that structure is really, really fulfilling. And more questions too. You found the difference in interest level between female and male students. It's just actually really interesting. I can stop screen sharing there. Um, as soon as I.
That question, I believe, was from Tanya, about whether there's a difference in the interest level between female and male students.
And that was really interesting, especially when I started the game club. I had, because it was kind of this typical game, uh, like, we're gonna play Call of Duty. No, we're not gonna play Call of Duty. We're gonna play Minecraft. And all the students who were coming in were usually like fifth grade boys, up to sixth, seventh, and eighth. Um, but there was a point at which I started telling students about D&D, and some of them already knew what it was, and
Hmm.
a lot of the time they were talking about it in terms of this high fantasy, and I said, no, I mean, I'm going to be a lot more about storytelling. And I had one or two girls come in and actually play a few quests with us. They didn't do the whole campaign.
Hmm.
Um, I would say definitely there's a difference, at least in terms of like sociocultural norms. You're more likely to find a big group of guys who might sit around the area playing board games. But the girls who did come for those two quests had an awesome time, and they were my big sticklers in terms of like really crafting a really great story. They were really into. I mean, if you have kids who like to act,
Hmm.
I'd say D&D, that's the place to be, because I mean, you can say, hey, make sure that you're staying in character. Oh, I get to be a character for an hour.
Oh,
This
well
is,
then,
and I have a whole sheet that describes what I'm supposed to do.
you
Um,
know, thank
I
you
have
for
a
giving me
question.
permission. Oh, go ahead, Trish, go.
Huh? Now, I'm with elementary kids, but I'm just wondering because there has frequently been negative connotations with Dungeons and Dragons
mhm.
um, over the years, and I haven't dealt with role-playing games that much with my crowd because of the fact we're predominantly Minecraft. But I'm curious, have you gotten any pushback from parents regarding the fact that you're doing Dungeons and Dragons?
So that's a great question, and it was something that, since I threw myself into this, I was about two quests in, and I thought, oh, we're playing Dungeons and Dragons, but get this, I also work at a Catholic school. Um, and so it became this really interesting discussion um, between the kids. I mean, it really boiled down to what fantasy is, and I mean that whole like that distinction between worlds and things like that. And I mean, just I had a younger student who has a social anxiety problems, and he was having a lot of trouble interacting with the other players. He would go into this mode where, oh, this is just a game, so I can be completely like off the wall and like talk about blowing things up and all these things that, like, if a parent walked into the room, they would probably feel really uncomfortable. And the best thing about that is that it did create a safe space to talk about that. I removed any sort of slightly religious connotations in the stories that I presented, and that I wasn't necessarily censoring things. I just decided not to focus on, like, oh, well, you're fighting off this god of death and murder. I mean, it was more about zombies, things that they've, seen in regular pop culture, and like specific things like that. The typical beholder, the big guy with the big eye and the eye stalks. Because that's kind of a quintessential D&D. And we actually had this really interesting conversation about religion, because they had to pick a god, and we had a conversation about the Pantheon, because I asked them, and it's like, what do you guys want to use? Because one of the big things in creating a narrative is you can decide to have a monotheistic universe, or you can have a pantheon of gods that you can base off of Nordic gods, Egyptian, whatever you want to call it. And thankfully, it's a progressive enough school that half the kids already knew all of these different things existed, and they were able to distinguish that. But it certainly was something that, as soon as I started thinking about it, being more sensitive about it prompted some really cool conversations. I would also say, though, that you have the option to not emphasize because there are entire monster manuals dedicated to planes of chaos and essentially the D&D equivalent of hell. And I think when people just see that, they get a bit thrown off, because they think, oh, they're talking about demons and things like that. But those are, if that's an issue, especially at the elementary level, it doesn't change the experience, to be perfectly honest, because you're the one making the story. That's a really good point. It was something that I was a little concerned about, but by the end of the thing, I had some great conversations with parents about how one of their kids had started a campaign, and so.
But you're absolutely right. Think about teaching, and here's the thing. I went to Catholic school. We learned about the Greek and Roman gods, and but think about if you were doing a campaign and you did base it on the Greek or Roman gods, and you played it that way.
That's great. You do that.
Yeah, are you kidding? I'm thinking for my community college students, it's like, the minute you said the Egyptian gods, I'm like, oh yeah, early humanities needs this with the Egyptian gods. Yep. Okay, so we're getting a class. So was this a club or a class? This
was a club. This is an after-school club. It started off running an hour after school, but as we, because it was kind of this mixed model to start, in that we did a lot of playing of games to start, and then as we went on throughout the semester, we split the time into first half you work on your own game, and then second half we play. And then eventually it became that second half we were pretty much exclusively playing D&D, and the first half they were writing their own stories and things like that.
We had some questions about if you involved any literacy teachers with your game design.
I actually had, not specifically literacy. I had a social studies teacher who I had some really long conversations about political structure in the small town.
Oh, cool!
That I crafted, and he's pretty into games as well. And he was one of the people that got me turned on to mega games and what he was using in his classroom in terms of setting up social structures. And one of the interests that you. Actually, I didn't see that much, but in terms, we're a smaller school, and we've got 3 ELA teachers. I did see one. Well, I think one student actually wrote about their D&D campaign in one of their classes. The teacher didn't ask me about that, but the student did. But in terms of collaborating with literacy teachers, I haven't done so much of that. And curriculum objectives, I mean, to finish off, if I could have them write a 3-paragraph, I mean, essentially essay about their character. That's what I asked them to do at the end, and kind of like, I mean, I didn't tell them it was an essay. I said, write about your experience in Dungeons and Dragons. And I had some real crazy stuff in terms, I mean, like good crazy stuff. In terms of, I had kind of my, I guess you could define him by my high flyer, the guy who like 3 days in was talking about starting his own campaign. He crafted essentially an entire universe that revolved around his character. And then that little guy I was talking about in 5th grade, who was having some troubles in general, he actually wrote a narrative that revolved around his interactions with other characters, which was a really that really tripped me out in terms of he was the one who was having the most difficulty relating to other characters to begin with. And he actually defined his character at the end by what other characters were doing, and so that was kind of the pretty much completely personalized. The grid was
and what we had was we had a question over chat if it was a club or a class, and also a comment. Sounds like the objectives were personalized. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, if it came down to it, like the only reason I was getting them to do those narratives is because I still have the graduate student twitch, where I like can't just do something and then not have like something to show for it. Oh yeah, reflection on it.
But in terms of it being reflect. And and also on the end, it was also a learning experience for myself in terms of organizing all that information. But yeah, in terms of objectives, just getting them to describe a character in this universe that we had built could be defined as that. But I can't really say that I have any sort of formal objectives that probably cut across students. Although I think that would be a spectacular thing to do for one of these clubs.
So if someone wanted to decide they wanted to start a club and they wanted to go the route you kind of did, how would you tell them to get started?
I would say first off, there's the D&D starter guide. I just read that to start. Say if you wanted to just, maybe you're not sure about what universe you want to use, but I think in general the D&D starter guide does a really good job of kind of putting you into this mindset of crafting your world. And for anyone who has ever done any sort of maybe improvisational or acting sort of stuff, I mean, that's usually what the conversation starts with, is this idea that you are an entity in this world, and you need to make this world come alive with all the information you provide. And I have a beginner's guide. And just in general, any beginner's guide. I mean, the amount of information that's out on the internet is, I mean, it's absolutely overwhelming to some degree. But the starter set would probably be a good place to go. Finding especially if you wanted to do D&D, finding a local game group, which is also available on Wizards. That can be a really good way to get started. Or also just playing a board game that might be heavier on the narrative side can be a good way to get you like thinking about how to set up a universe and a rule set that you might want to use in your club or class.
And would you also suggest to them like maybe grabbing a copy of The Hobbit, just to
you need content. Yeah, and that real life. That's a really good point. Because that was the thing that really got me enthusiastic about this ISTE event, is because I was struggling with like, oh, do I just take a campaign that has already been built and we'll do that? And I started thinking about ISTE as an adventurer, and you can kind of, I mean, you can so take all this information from outside, and you can start thinking about things in terms of, well, what if we made this into a game? People, I mean, I always think it's so interesting when people talk about, like, oh man, the interactions at our office are so complicated, and sometimes it feels like you're playing a card game. Like, what if we made cards for every person in the office? And I mean, that's essentially what, I mean, that's my plan, at least. Like, I think from this point on until it stops working, all of my campaigns are going to have some sort of reference to real life. Like, I mean, half of it because of that. But then there's also that, like, that benefit you were talking about in terms of, you know, teaching about gods. I mean, what if you were able to support that sort of transfer in your D&D campaign by saying, oh, well, this is a group of people that are harassing another group of people based on their species. What does that sound like? What did you guys learn about in social studies that might have been referred to that? But that's teacher me talking.
Yeah, but we can't help that stuff. And Chris had pulled up something. Chris, can you pull back to the character sheet? Now this is a character sheet. So it's not like you know, like you're waving a wand and saying, like, oh, you're a gnome, be a gnome. No, there's a lot of statistics that go with the character and a lot of information, right?
Yeah, and when you're starting with that, my biggest recommendation would be, it's really easy to be overwhelmed, in the same sense that it's really difficult for me to start working out, because I go into a place and there's all these machines and all these different things that you can interact with. I started my kids, I gave them a character sheet, and I told them to write a story about their character, and, like, describe what your character looks like. They started asking me about numbers. I said, don't worry about that. We'll get to that when we get to that. And that becomes a lot easier, especially even after you start the campaign, because you start having discussions about, is it still up?
Yeah.
But, like, those stats like strength, constitution. A student asked me, what does the word constitution mean? Well, it's a document that the forefathers wrote. No. I started describing, was like, well, constitution is one way that you can describe, like, your health and your healthiness and your ability to withstand disease, and strength is kind of the same thing. And especially when it was already embedded into a narrative. So, like, when a student tried to open a window, I said, make a strength check, which meant they had to roll a dice and get a total over an amount I had predefined, and then they add their strength to whatever their dice had done. So if they have really low strength, there's a much lower likelihood that they're going to actually successfully open the window. But if you start with that sort of narrative component that's later on, it's actually on the second page, that makes things really easy. The really cool thing, though, is that personalization component. You'll have students who immediately want to jump into the character creation numbers part. You'll have your power levelers, your like, what are they called? Your min-maxers. Like, basically, students, they want to make a character that's, like, really awesome and, like, will be able to fight anything that comes along. So you can kind of get these two, I mean, seemingly disparate sets of students. On the one end, the ones that really want to talk about how, like, oh, I have this past where my parents were abducted and and then the kids who are just like, oh man, 18's a really good number for this strength roll that I want to make.
And yeah, Chris has been showing this as he's been going through some sheets as you've been talking. So the thing about it is, when it comes okay, and I don't know if Tanya wants to jump on, or if not, I can read the comment. And if she doesn't jump on, like, within the next second. Oh, okay, cool, because it's a really great comment.
Yeah, I maybe it's the last one about a great way to begin a coding class. I mean, game design class. A lot of high schools now are teaching game design as part of, to entice students into coding, and there is course codes in probably every state for game design classes. and kids kind of just jump in because they want to do the fun stuff, and then they don't know what to do. And this is so complex. I had no idea, but if you figure this all out, it'll make the coding that much easier.
Yeah, and because this is, I mean, essentially what, I mean, when you encounter an NPC in a video game, in a really complex video game, say something like The Witcher, I mean, it's not going to look exactly like this, but there are values associated with a lot of different interactions that you might have with this person. And that's one of the big things. I mean, the pen and paper equivalent is D&D, essentially. I mean, there are also, I mean, for those students who might go even farther afield and you can't get them to write or read anything, there are programs like Roll20, Roll20.net, that you can do everything online, everything's tracked online, character sheets and everything like that. And then also just D&D-based games. So they're video games that are written in the world of Dungeons and Dragons, and they use all of the same rules, but all of the rules are in the background. So you see like a little screen where rolls are being done, but you're moving a character across a room. And so you kind of get to, and that coding, that actually would be a perfect example of like showing a student a D&D game and say like, hey, look at all these calculations that are going on as you walk across this room or as you try and cast this spell.
So, does anybody have any last questions for Russell?
I wanted to bring up Trish's comment on reenacting like the Percy Jackson novels. I think that's spectacular. And the Hobbit comment you made before. I'm gonna talk to my ELA teachers about books that they're doing this year and seeing if like, I mean, because we have mock trial, you know. That's, I mean, it's all kind of the same thing. The advantage of D&D and taking that structure though is that it adds that degree of the random number generation, that's the dice, as well as kind of that is a bit more structure in terms of how the universe works. But I love that idea of taking something and like from a book that students might be reading and really pull them in with that.
No, that's really cool, and I know at the LAN party people were seriously enjoying your campaign.
I have a couple of very short questions. I'm curious as to whether your students worked alone or did they work in teams, and how much they used other games that they played as a reference.
The influence of other games was pretty obvious across the board. Like I had a student who played a lot of kind of civilization type games, and the first thing that he wanted to do was make a more like political climate, and basically how do I get these different cities interacting with each other. So that was a huge impact, and one of the things that I'd always tell my students when we'd start, and one of the reasons why they eventually asked me, well, when are we going to make games, is because, I mean, for them, a lot of the time they hadn't seen a diversity of game types. And so playing different games, getting your students exposed to different types of games, that was a really big part of that. What was the first question? I totally went off on that tangent.
If they worked alone or if they worked in teams.
I was flexible with that. I had 3 students who worked as kind of a group, and they went back and forth in terms of how they were setting things up. The emergent groups were really useful because I was able to get some students who were a bit more savvy with maybe playing around with Unity or Scratch, and they were able to make things really easily, whereas you had the students who kind of had this really high level in terms of what they want the game to look like. But that was only really the only team that I set up, or that they set up, actually. Most of it was individual works, and I would kind of coach them from the sideline. One thing that I'm transitioning into for this year is trying to do like a full-on game group where everyone's working together on a singular game, because I think that's going to provide us with more structure and better defined roles that we can switch around. So yeah, I didn't define that before, but I think that's going to benefit us a lot more, saying, okay, we're all on a team. You're the coder today. You're the designer. and so on and so forth, to be able to get students thinking about how those pieces fit together.
And as a follow-up to that, I can't help but wonder, you know, say a book, even a classic that they read in a literature class, I'm talking high school kids now, or possibly something a little more current like Hunger Games, which I don't think is a game yet. But if you took a book like that and tried to make a game out of it, you know, a book that they have to read anyway in English.
Well, Minecraft has some great Hunger Game maps that I mean, great example of that sort of infiltration into a space, and you know, being able to take a game like Minecraft and opening that up. And I think, I mean, I really like that idea of adapting books, because you've got this really rich D&D universe, but you've also got these really rich and relatable universes that are set up in young adult fiction a lot of the time.
Okay, well, I think that's all the time we have for now. Thank you very much for what you did at the ISTE conference and for doing this hangout with us. So,
Great.
bye,
Good
everybody.
questions.